George Strait saw two children at the market asking for food, and what he did moved everyone. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the Walmart parking lot, creating waves of heat that distorted the air like a mirage. In this urban desert, two small figures moved between the towering vehicles, like lost souls searching for salvation. Sofia Martinez, barely 5 years old, clutched her older brother Miguel's calloused hand with the desperation of someone who understood that letting go meant facing the world alone. Her once pink dress, now faded to the color of old roses, hung loosely on her tiny frame, telling a story of countless washes and even more countless hungry days. Miguel, at 8 years old, carried the weight of responsibility that no child should bear. His dark eyes, wise beyond his years, scanned the parking lot with the calculated precision of a seasoned survivor. The boy had learned to read faces quickly, distinguishing between those who might offer kindness and those who would turn away in disgust or fear. His stomach cramped violently, reminding him that the single piece of stale bread they had shared the night before was nothing more than a distant memory. "Miguel, my tummy hurts," Sofia whispered in Spanish, her voice barely audible above the hum of car engines and distant traffic. Her small hand pressed against her stomach, trying to silence the growling that had become their constant companion. "I know, Hermanita," Miguel replied, his voice carrying a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the hardness life had forced upon him. "We're going to find food today. I promise you." It was a promise he had made countless times before, but he continued to make it because it was the only thing keeping his little sister's hope alive. The parking lot stretched before them like an ocean of opportunity and rejection. Families loaded groceries into their cars, the bags filled with more food than the children had seen in weeks. Miguel watched a woman struggle with numerous shopping bags, her car packed with enough provisions to feed an army. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would likely be another rejection, another look of suspicion or disgust. As Miguel observed the ebb and flow of shoppers, I want to pause here and ask you, our incredible viewers, to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if this story is touching your heart. Please share with us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about these brave children's situation. Your support means everything to us as we bring you these powerful stories of hope and transformation. "Excuse me, ma'am." Miguel approached the woman with careful steps, his voice polite despite his nervousness. "Could you possibly spare any food? My sister and I, we haven't eaten since yesterday." His words carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language, each syllable shaped with deliberate care. The woman, dressed in expensive athletic wear with perfectly manicured nails, looked down at the children with a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. Her eyes quickly assessed their appearance, taking in Miguel's worn sneakers with holes near the toes and Sofia's tangled hair that hadn't seen a proper brush in days. "I don't give money to beggars," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You should be in school, not bothering hardworking people. Where are your parents?" Without waiting for an answer, she slammed her car door and drove away, leaving the children standing in a cloud of exhaust fumes. Sofia's lower lip began to tremble, but Miguel squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay, Sofia. Not everyone can help, but someone will." His words were as much for himself as for his sister, a mantra he repeated to keep despair at bay. Their mother, Carla Martinez, was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, not by choice, but by the cruel hand of circumstance that seemed determined to test every fiber of her being. For the past 3 days, she had been by her mother's bedside in the county hospital, watching as the woman who had raised her fought for every breath after suffering a massive stroke. Carla worked 3 jobs to keep their small family afloat, cleaning offices at night, working at a restaurant during lunch hours, and caring for elderly residents at a nursing home on weekends. The call had come during her restaurant shift, a frantic voice explaining that her mother had collapsed at home. Carla had dropped everything, racing to the hospital without thinking about the children she was leaving behind. Her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had promised to watch them, but the elderly woman had her own health problems and couldn't always be relied upon. When Mrs. Rodriguez had fallen ill herself, Miguel and Sofia found themselves alone, with nothing but their courage and each other. The children continued their careful journey through the parking lot, approaching shoppers with the politeness their mother had drilled into them. Always say please and thank you, Carla had taught them. Always look people in the eye and speak clearly. Show them you're good children. But good children, they were learning, were not always enough to soften hardened hearts. A man in a business suit brushed past them without acknowledgement. A teenager with earbuds ignored Miguel's carefully rehearsed request. An elderly couple shook their heads sadly, but offered nothing more than sympathetic looks. Each rejection felt like a small death, chipping away at their hope piece by piece. The sun climbed higher, turning the asphalt into a griddle that burned through the thin soles of Miguel's shoes. Sofia had stopped complaining about her hunger, which worried Miguel more than her earlier whimpers. He knew that silence often meant his sister had moved beyond discomfort into a dangerous state of resignation. "One more try," Miguel whispered to himself, spotting a young mother loading groceries while her toddler sat in a shopping cart, happily munching on goldfish crackers. Surely another mother would understand, would feel compassion for children in need. "Excuse me, miss," Miguel approached with renewed hope. "My sister and I are very hungry. Could you possibly share even a small amount of food?" The young mother looked at them with genuine concern, her maternal instincts clearly triggered by the sight of the desperate children. For a moment, Miguel thought they had finally found their angel, but then her expression changed, fear replacing compassion as she glanced around nervously. "I'm sorry, I wish I could help, but—" She gestured vaguely, as if the very air around them was somehow dangerous. "You really shouldn't be here alone. It's not safe." She quickly finished loading her car and departed, leaving Miguel and Sofia standing in the growing heat with their hopes dashed once again. It was then that Miguel noticed the security guard watching them from across the parking lot. The man was built like a bull, with arms that strained against his uniform shirt, and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a scowl. His name tag read Richard, and everything about his posture screamed authority and intolerance. Richard had been watching the children for several minutes, his irritation growing with each interaction they attempted. In his mind, these kids represented everything wrong with society, everything that made his job more difficult. He had dealt with panhandlers before, but using children as bait was particularly despicable in his opinion. As Miguel prepared to approach another shopper, he saw Richard begin to move in their direction with purposeful strides. The security guard's hand rested on his radio, and his expression promised nothing but trouble. Miguel's survival instincts, honed by months of living on the edge, immediately recognized danger. "Sofia," he whispered urgently, "we need to stay close together. That man is coming toward us, and he doesn't look friendly." But it was too late to run, too late to hide, and certainly too late to disappear into the crowd of shoppers who had already proven their indifference to the children's plight. Richard was closing in, and Miguel could only hope that whatever was about to happen wouldn't end with them being separated from each other, the one thing that would truly break both their hearts and spirits completely. The memories of better times flickered through Miguel's mind like old photographs. He remembered when their father, Carlos, had been alive, working construction and coming home each evening covered in dust, but smiling broadly as he scooped both children into his powerful arms. Their small apartment had been filled with laughter then, with the smell of Carla's homemade tortillas and the sound of Carlos teaching Miguel to play guitar. But Carlos had died in a workplace accident 2 years ago, leaving Carla to navigate survival alone. The insurance money had lasted 6 months before reality set in with crushing force. Medical bills consumed their savings, forcing them to move to a smaller place in a rougher neighborhood where sirens sang the children to sleep. It was Carlos who had taught Miguel that being a man meant protecting those smaller and weaker than yourself, a lesson that now felt like both a blessing and a terrible burden. As Richard approached, Miguel instinctively positioned himself slightly in front of Sofia, his thin body serving as what little shield he could offer. The security guard's footsteps echoed against the concrete with the rhythm of approaching doom, each step measured and deliberate. Other shoppers began to notice the confrontation brewing, some slowing their pace to watch the drama unfold, while others hurried past, unwilling to become involved in whatever unpleasantness was about to occur. "Hey!" Richard's voice boomed across the parking lot, causing several nearby customers to turn in alarm. "You two, what do you think you're doing bothering these good people?" His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Without question, the kind of voice that had intimidated countless troublemakers over the years. Miguel's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom, but he forced himself to stand straight and meet the man's gaze. His mother had taught him to always show respect to adults, even when they didn't deserve it. "We're just asking for help, sir. We haven't eaten and—" "I don't want to hear your sob story, kid," Richard interrupted, his meaty hand reaching out to grab Miguel's shoulder with unnecessary force. "This is private property, and you're trespassing. You're also harassing customers, which is against the law." His grip tightened, fingers digging into the boy's thin shoulder blade through his worn t-shirt. Sophia whimpered and pressed closer to her brother, her small hands clutching at his free arm. The sight of her terror only fueled Miguel's determination to protect her, even though he felt like David facing Goliath without even a slingshot for defense. "Please, sir." Miguel tried again, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "We're not trying to cause trouble. Our mom is at the hospital with our grandmother and we're just hungry. We'll leave if you want. But could you maybe help us find something to eat first?" Richard's face reddened with anger, and perhaps something else, something uglier that spoke to deep-seated prejudices he carried like badges of honor. "Listen here, you little con artist. I've seen this scam 100 times before. Use the cute kids to tug at heartstrings, make people feel sorry for you, then take their money and run back to whoever's really running this operation." The accusation hit Miguel like a physical blow. To be called a con artist, to have his genuine desperation dismissed as some elaborate scheme, was almost worse than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. "That's not true, sir. We're not lying. We really need help." "Save it for someone stupid enough to believe you," Richard snarled, his grip shifting to both children now as he began to march them toward the front of the store. "I'm calling the police, and they can sort out what to do with a couple of juvenile delinquents like you." The crowd of onlookers grew larger, phones appearing like magic as people began recording the confrontation. Some faces showed sympathy for the children, others displayed the same suspicion that Richard wore like armor, but most showed simple curiosity, the kind of rubbernecking that turns tragedy into entertainment. Miguel tried to keep up with Richard's long strides while supporting Sophia, who had begun crying in earnest. Her sobs cut through him like knives, each tear a reminder of his failure to protect her. "Please don't call the police," he begged, his voice cracking. "We'll leave right now. We promise we won't come back." "Too late for that, boy," Richard replied with satisfaction. "Should have thought about consequences before you decided to run your little game here. Maybe a night in. Juvenile detention will teach you both some respect." What Richard didn't know was that among the crowd, a tall man in a simple cowboy hat and jeans had been watching the entire confrontation. George Strait had entered the parking lot just as the security guard began his aggressive approach, and something about the scene triggered every protective instinct the country music legend possessed. Perhaps it was the way the boy tried to shield his little sister, or maybe it was the genuine terror in their eyes. George remembered his own childhood in Texas, raised by parents who taught him that character was measured by how you treated those who couldn't fight back. He thought of his son George Jr., taken too soon, and wondered what kind of man his boy might have become. The sight of these children being brutalized by an adult who should have been protecting them stirred something primal and righteous within him. As Richard continued his verbal assault on Miguel and Sophia, George Strait began walking slowly but purposefully toward the confrontation, his jaw set with determination and his eyes burning with barely controlled anger. The king of country. Music was about to make an entrance that no one in that parking lot would ever forget, and Richard's world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. "Excuse me," came a calm, steady voice from behind Richard, cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. The security guard spun around, still gripping both children firmly, his face flushed with the adrenaline of exerting his authority over those he perceived as beneath him. George Strait stood there with the quiet confidence that had made him a legend, his presence somehow commanding despite the simplicity of his appearance. He wore well-worn jeans, a plain white button-down shirt, and his signature cowboy hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. To most observers, he looked like any other Texas rancher who had stopped by the store for supplies. "This doesn't concern you, mister," Richard snapped, his grip tightening on the children, as if George might try to steal them away. "These kids are trespassing and harassing customers. I'm handling the situation according to store policy." George's eyes moved from Richard's face to where his hands gripped Miguel and Sophia, noting the way the little girl trembled and how the boy tried to stand straighter despite his obvious fear. Something in the country star's expression shifted, hardening in a way that would have warned anyone familiar with him that they had crossed a line. "Store policy involves manhandling children?" George asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made several nearby shoppers pause in their activities. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you're the one causing a disturbance." Richard bristled at the challenge to his authority. Years of dealing with what he considered the dregs of society had made him defensive and quick to anger. When questioned, "Look, cowboy, I don't know who you think you are, but I've got a job to do here. These little con artists have been working this parking lot all morning, bothering decent folks with their sob stories." "Is that what you call it?" George stepped closer, and for the first time, Richard noticed that this wasn't just any random customer. There was something familiar about the man's face, something that nagged at the edge of his memory. A sob story? Miguel, still caught in Richard's grasp, looked up at this stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayer. The boy had heard enough country music in his short life to recognize something special about the man's voice, even when speaking normally. There was a quality to it that reminded him of the radio songs his father used to sing along with during their car rides to construction sites. "Please, sir," Miguel addressed George directly, his voice small but determined. "We're not lying. We really are hungry. Our mama is at the hospital with our abuela, and we haven't eaten since yesterday. We're not trying to trick anyone." Richard jerked Miguel's arm roughly. "I told you to shut up with that story. Nobody's buying it." He turned back to George, his patience wearing thin. "Listen, whoever you are, this is none of your business. Move along before I call the police on you too for interfering with security operations." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and George felt something inside him snap. He thought of all the times he had been blessed in his career, all the opportunities he had been given, and here was a chance to use that blessing to help two children who had nowhere else to turn. More than that, he thought of his own son. Forever, young in his memory, and knew that George Jr. would have expected his father to do the right thing. "Actually," George said, reaching slowly into his back pocket, "why don't we call the police? I think they'd be very interested to hear about how you're treating these children." He pulled out his phone, and as he did, his wallet came partially out as well, revealing a Texas driver's license with his name clearly visible. A woman standing nearby with her teenage daughter suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Jennifer, do you know who that is?" she whispered, though not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. The teenager squinted at George, then her eyes widened in recognition. "Mom, that's George Strait. That's actually George Strait." Her voice carried farther than she intended, and suddenly other shoppers began to take notice, phones appearing. As people realized, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Richard's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds as the name registered. Even someone with limited knowledge of country music knew who George Strait was. The king of country music, the man who had sold more albums than almost any artist in history, was standing in this parking lot, confronting him about his treatment of two homeless children. "Mr. Strait," Richard stammered, his grip on the children loosening slightly as he tried to process this new development. I didn't realize. Look, sir, I'm just trying to do my job here. These kids were bothering customers, and store policy says nothing about terrorizing children." George interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Now, I suggest you let go of them before this gets any more embarrassing for you than it already has." But Richard, despite his recognition of the celebrity, was too deep into his power trip to back down gracefully. "Mr. Strait, with all due respect, you don't understand what these people are like. They use kids to run scams, to make people feel sorry for them. I've seen it 100 times. They probably aren't even related." The accusation hit George like a physical blow. To suggest that these children were being used by adults, that their obvious distress was somehow fabricated, revealed a level of cynicism and prejudice that the singer found genuinely shocking. "What I see," George said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried further than if he had shouted, "is a grown man bullying two hungry children, while a crowd of people stands around recording it for social media instead of helping." He was right about the phones. Dozens of them were now pointed at the scene, capturing every word and gesture. The incident was already being live-streamed to thousands of viewers, comments pouring in as people around the world began to witness what was unfolding in this Texas parking lot. Sophia, who had been quietly crying throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up in a small, trembling voice. "Senor, are you really famous? Like on TV?" George's expression softened immediately as he looked down at the little girl. He crouched to her level, bringing himself eye to eye with both children while carefully avoiding any sudden movements that might frighten them further. "Hi there, sweetheart," he said gently, his famous voice now warm and comforting. "My name is George. What's your name?" "Sophia," she whispered, then pointed to her brother. "And that's Miguel. He takes care of me because Mama had to go to the hospital." "You're both very brave," George told them, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "Miguel, you're doing a good job looking after your sister. Your mama would be proud." Richard watched this interaction with growing unease. The crowd around them was getting larger, and he could hear murmurs of disapproval directed his way. Someone called out, "Let those babies go!" while another voice added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." "Mr. Strait," Richard tried again, his voice now pleading rather than authoritative, "surely you understand that we have to maintain order. We can't just let anyone—" "Anyone what?" George stood slowly, his 6-foot frame seeming even taller as he faced down the security guard. "Anyone hungry? Anyone desperate? Anyone who looks different from you? Each question landed like a hammer blow, and Richard flinched with each one. The crowd was now openly hostile toward Richard, and several people had begun calling for the store manager. George noticed an elderly woman pushing through the gathering crowd, her face set with determination. "Young man," she called out to Richard, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 6 children and wasn't about to let this slide. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Those babies are hungry, and instead of helping them, you're treating them like criminals." "Mom, please stay back," Richard said weakly, but his authority was completely gone now. He looked around desperately for backup, for anyone who might support his position, but found only disapproving faces and recording phones. George reached into his wallet and pulled out several $100s in cash. "Kids," he said to Miguel and Sophia, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" Miguel looked uncertain about whether he should answer, glancing nervously at Richard, who still held them, though his grip had become noticeably looser. "Yesterday morning," Miguel finally admitted. "Mama left us some cereal, but we finished it, and Mrs. Rodriguez was supposed to watch us, but she got sick too." The admission sent a wave of anger through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Those children are starving," while another voice added, "This is disgraceful." George's jaw tightened. "Richard, is it?" he asked, reading the man's name tag. "I want you to let go of these children right now, and then I want you to walk away. Don't say another word, don't make another excuse, just walk away and let me help these kids." But Richard, perhaps sensing that his job was already in jeopardy, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Strait, I understand you want to help, but if we start feeding every kid who shows up here with a story, we'll be overrun. There are procedures, proper channels." "Proper channels?" George's voice rose for the first time, and the crowd fell silent. "The proper channel for hungry children is to feed them. The proper channel for scared kids is to comfort them. The proper channel for someone in your position is to protect them, not terrorize them." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "I want everyone here to think about what they just witnessed. 2 children, hungry and scared, asking for help in the most polite way possible. And this man's response was to grab them, threaten them, and call them criminals." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Richard finally seemed to realize that he had lost completely. His hands dropped away from the children, as if they had suddenly become too hot to touch. Miguel immediately pulled Sophia closer to him. Both children instinctively moving toward George, as if recognizing him as their protector. The sight of their trust, so freely given despite everything they had endured, nearly brought tears to the country star's eyes. "Now," George said, his voice returning to its normal calm tone as he looked down at Miguel and Sophia, "who wants to go shopping for some groceries? I think it's time we got you 2 properly fed." But as he spoke these words, George noticed a black sedan pulling into the parking lot, and his heart sank as he recognized the distinctive markings of a police car. Someone had called law enforcement, and now the situation was about to become even more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The police cruiser moved slowly through the crowd of onlookers, its presence causing people to step back and create a path. Through the windshield, George could see 2 officers, their expressions serious as they took in the scene before them. Miguel's body tensed as he spotted the approaching vehicle, his protective instincts kicking in once again. "Hey, Sophia," he whispered urgently, "stay close to me, okay?" The little girl nodded, pressing herself against her brother's side. Richard seemed to regain some composure at the sight of law enforcement. Perhaps he thought their arrival would vindicate his actions, that the officers would side with him. He straightened his uniform shirt and prepared to make his case, unaware that his entire confrontation with the children had been recorded from multiple angles and was already spreading across social media platforms. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the parking lot that George Strait was involved in some kind of incident. What had started as a simple case of hungry children asking for help had transformed into something much larger, something that would soon capture the attention of news outlets across the country. The police cruiser came to a stop near the growing crowd, and two officers emerged with the practiced caution of veterans who had responded to countless disturbance calls. The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, had been working this beat for 15 years and had seen his share of celebrity encounters, though never under circumstances quite like these. His partner, Officer Johnson, was newer to the force, but had already developed a reputation for fairness and level-headedness. As they approached the scene, Sergeant Martinez immediately noticed the unusual dynamics at play. A large crowd had formed around what appeared to be a confrontation between a security guard, two small children, and a man in a cowboy hat who seemed oddly familiar. Phones were everywhere, recording every moment, and the tension in the air was palpable. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sergeant Martinez called out, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of experience. The crowd parted slightly to allow the officers through, though many continued filming, hoping to capture whatever was about to unfold. Richard stepped forward immediately, eager to present his version of events before anyone else could speak. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. These children have been harassing customers all morning, running some kind of scam operation. When I tried to handle the situation according to store policy, this gentleman," he gestured toward George, "interfered with my duties." George remained calm, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but there was steel in his voice when he spoke. "Officer, my name is George Strait, and what I witnessed was this man physically restraining two hungry children and verbally abusing them for the crime of asking for food." Sergeant Martinez did a double take at the name, recognition dawning on his face. He had grown up listening to George Strait's music, had played Amarillo Morning at his wedding, and owned every album the man had ever recorded. But this was a professional situation, and he pushed his fan emotions aside to focus on the matter at hand. "Mr. Strait," he said with a respectful nod, "can you tell me exactly what you observed?" Before George could answer, Miguel stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation with surprising clarity. "Officer, sir, we weren't trying to cause trouble. We were just asking people for food because we haven't eaten since yesterday, and our mama is at the hospital with our abuela who had a stroke." The sincerity in the boy's voice was unmistakable, and Officer Johnson crouched down to Miguel's eye level. "What's your name, son?" "Miguel Martinez, sir. And this is my sister Sophia. She's only 5, and she's really hungry." Miguel's protective instincts remained strong, even in the presence of law enforcement, one arm wrapped around his sister's shoulders. Officer Johnson noticed the children's last name was the same as his partner's and glanced meaningfully at Sergeant Martinez, who had also caught the coincidence. The sergeant's expression softened as he looked at the two children, seeing in them echoes of his own grandchildren. "And where exactly is your mother, Miguel?" Sergeant Martinez asked gently. "At County General Hospital, sir. Our abuela collapsed 3 days ago, and Mama has been staying with her. Mrs. Rodriguez was supposed to watch us, but she got sick too, so we've been taking care of each other." Richard scoffed loudly. "You see, officers, classic sob story. They've probably memorized this script. I guarantee you if you check there's an adult running this operation using these kids to—" "Enough!" George interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "Sergeant Martinez, I'd like to make a formal complaint against this security guard for harassment and assault of minors. I have dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings of him physically restraining these children and verbally abusing them." The crowd murmured agreement, several people stepping forward with their phones. "I got it all recorded," called out one woman. "He was terrible to them," shouted another voice. Sergeant Martinez looked around at the crowd, then back at Richard, whose confidence was beginning to waver. "Sir, did you physically restrain these children?" "I was detaining them according to store policy for trespassing, and—" "Did you or did you not put your hands on these children?" the sergeant interrupted, his tone becoming sharper. Richard's face reddened. "Well, yes, but I had to maintain order. You can't just let people run wild in a parking lot. These kids were bothering customers, making people uncomfortable." "They were asking for food," George said quietly, but his words carried across the parking lot like a judgment. "Politely asking for food because they were hungry." Officer Johnson had been observing the children throughout the conversation, noting their worn clothing, the way Sophia leaned against her brother for comfort, and the genuine fear in their eyes when they looked at Richard. Everything about their demeanor suggested they were telling the truth. "Mr. Strait," Officer Johnson said, "you mentioned wanting to help these children. What exactly did you have in mind?" George looked down at Miguel and Sophia, his heart breaking at the sight of their hopeful faces. "I was going to take them inside the store, buy them some groceries, and help them contact their mother at the hospital. These kids shouldn't be out here alone, and they certainly shouldn't be going hungry." "And you, sir," Sergeant Martinez turned to Richard. "What was your plan? Were you actually going to arrest 2 hungry children?" Richard looked around desperately, realizing that public opinion had turned completely against him. "I was going to call child services, let them handle it. That's the proper procedure for unaccompanied minors." "The proper procedure," George said, his voice rising slightly, "would have been to show compassion, to help them, not humiliate them." A commotion near the store's entrance caught everyone's attention. The store manager, a nervous-looking man in his 40s named David Chen, was hurrying toward the scene with several employees in tow. He had been inside dealing with inventory when word reached him that there was an incident involving a celebrity in his parking lot. "Officers, I'm David Chen, the store manager. What seems to be the problem here?" His eyes darted nervously between the police, the crowd, and the phones still recording everything. Sergeant Martinez quickly summarized the situation while Mr. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned. As a father himself, the idea of children going hungry in his store's parking lot was deeply troubling. As a business manager, the thought of negative publicity involving a celebrity was terrifying. Mr. Chen," George addressed the manager directly, "I assume your store has policies about how employees treat customers, especially vulnerable ones like children." "Absolutely, Mr. Strait. We have strict guidelines about treating all customers with respect and dignity." Mr. Chen shot a meaningful look at Richard, who seemed to shrink under the attention. "And would you say that physically restraining hungry children and calling them criminals aligns with those policies?" Mr. Chen's face went pale. "Absolutely not. Richard, is this true? Did you actually put your hands on these children?" Before Richard could answer, several people in the crowd called out confirmations. "He grabbed them. He was pulling them around. It was awful to watch." Miguel spoke up again, his young voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. "Mr. Chen, sir, we weren't trying to cause trouble for your store. We were just asking people in the parking lot if they could share any food. We didn't go inside or bother anyone who told us no." The store manager looked down at the boy, seeing the sincerity in his eyes and the protective way he held his sister. "Son, you and your sister are welcome in my store anytime. And Richard," he turned to the security guard, "you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation." Richard's face went white. "Mr. Chen, you can't do this to me. I was following protocol, maintaining order." "You were terrorizing children," Mr. Chen said firmly. "Security badge and radio now." As Richard reluctantly handed over his equipment, George pulled out his phone. "Sergeant Martinez, Would it be all right if I called the hospital to check on the children's story and locate their mother? That would be very helpful, Mr. Strait. George dialed information and was soon connected to County General Hospital. Yes, I'm calling to check on a patient named Martinez, who was admitted with a stroke approximately 3 days ago. This is regarding her grandchildren who are currently... Yes, I'll hold. The parking lot fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic as everyone waited for the call to be completed. Sophia had grown tired and was now sitting on the curb, her head resting against Miguel's shoulder. Several people in the crowd looked at the children with obvious sympathy, some wiping away tears. "Yes, I'm here," George said into the phone. "Is there a woman named Carla Martinez there with the patient?" "I see. Could you please ask her to come to the phone? This is regarding her children." "Yes, I'll wait." After what felt like an eternity, George's expression brightened. "Carla, my name is George Strait, and I'm here with your children, Miguel and Sophia. They're safe, but they're very hungry and have been asking for food in a parking lot." "Yes, ma'am, they're fine. They're very brave children, and Miguel has been taking excellent care of his sister." George listened for several minutes, his expression growing more sympathetic as Carla apparently explained her situation. "I understand completely, ma'am. You had to make an impossible choice, and anyone would have done the same thing." "No, ma'am, they're not in trouble. In fact, I'd like to help if you'll let me." He handed the phone to Miguel. "Your mama wants to talk to you." Miguel's face lit up as he took the phone. "Mama, are you okay? Is Abuela getting better?" He listened intently, then said, "We're okay, Mama. We were just hungry, and this nice man is helping us. His name is George, and he's famous." After a few more minutes, Miguel handed the phone back to George, who spoke briefly with Carla before ending the call. "Officers, I've confirmed their story. Their mother has been at the hospital around the clock caring for her mother, who suffered a massive stroke. The neighbor who was supposed to watch the children became ill herself." Sergeant Martinez nodded. "And what's your plan now, Mr. Strait?" George looked down at Miguel and Sophia, then at the crowd of people who had been watching this drama unfold. An idea was forming in his mind, something that went far beyond simply buying these children groceries. He thought about his concert that evening, about the message he wanted to send, about the opportunity to turn this moment of injustice into something transformative. "Well," George said slowly, "I think it's time we got these kids fed, reunited, and them with their mother, and maybe showed this community what real compassion looks like." But as he spoke these words, George's phone buzzed with a text message that would change everything. The message was from his tour manager, and it contained news that would not only alter the course of this day, but would reveal a connection between George and these children that none of them could have possibly imagined. George glanced at his phone screen, and his face went completely white. His hands began to tremble slightly as he read the message again, unable to believe what he was seeing. The tour manager had sent him information about tonight's venue, but it was the attachment that made George's world tilt on its axis. "Mr. Strait?" Sergeant Martinez asked, noticing the sudden change in the country star's demeanor. "Is everything all right?" George looked from his phone to Miguel and Sophia, then back to his phone again. The crowd noticed his reaction, murmurs beginning to ripple through the gathering as people wondered what could have affected the famous singer so dramatically. George began, then stopped himself. This wasn't the time or place for what he had just discovered, but the implications were staggering, and it explained so much about why he had felt such an immediate connection to these children. Miguel looked up at George with concern. "Senor George, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The innocence in the boy's question nearly brought tears to George's eyes. If what his tour manager had just sent him was true, then this entire encounter had been more than just chance. It had been destiny. George took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just learned. The text message from his tour manager contained information that went far beyond tonight's concert details. Attached was a newspaper clipping from 2 years ago, an article about a construction worker named Carlos Martinez who had died in a workplace accident. But it wasn't just any construction worker, it was the man who had been working on renovations at George's own ranch when the tragedy occurred. "Senor George," Miguel's voice cut through George's thoughts, bringing him back to the present moment. "Are you sure you're okay?" George looked down at the boy, seeing not just a hungry child now, but the son of a man who had died while working on his property. Carlos Martinez had been part of a crew renovating George's stables, and the accident had happened when a scaffold collapsed during a storm. George remembered the incident vividly. He had been out of town for a concert series, but his ranch manager had called him immediately. The guilt had eaten at him for months, knowing that a good man had lost his life while improving his property. "Miguel," George said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "what was your father's full name?" "Carlos Eduardo Martinez, sir. He worked in construction. He used to tell us stories about the big houses and ranches he worked on." Miguel's face lit up with the memory. He said someday he was going to build Mama the most beautiful house in all of Texas. George's heart nearly stopped. It was him. Carlos Martinez, the man who had died at his ranch, was the father of these 2 precious children standing before him. The coincidence was too extraordinary to be mere chance. In all of Texas, in all the world, these children had ended up hungry, in a parking lot where George happened to be shopping. "Miguel," George continued carefully, "do you remember what your father looked like?" The boy nodded eagerly. He was tall and strong, with hands that were always a little dirty from work, but gentle when he hugged us. He had a scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike as a kid, and he always smelled like sawdust and that cologne Mama bought him for Christmas. George reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the newspaper clipping. His assistant had sent him 2 years ago about the accident. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and showed Miguel the photo that accompanied the article. Miguel's eyes widened as he stared at the newspaper. That's my papa." "But how do you have this? Did you know him?" The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Sergeant Martinez stepped closer, his professional instincts telling him that this conversation was important. George crouched, down to Miguel's level, his eyes now bright with unshed tears. "Miguel, your father was working at my ranch when the accident happened. I've carried the guilt of his death for 2 years, wishing I could have done something, anything to prevent it." The revelation hit Miguel like a physical blow. His young mind struggled to comprehend the significance of what George was telling him. "Your ranch? Papa was working at your ranch when he—" "Yes, son, and I've been looking for your family ever since, wanting to help, wanting to make things right. But your mother moved after the insurance settlement, and I lost track of you." George's voice broke as he continued. "Finding you here today, like this, it's not a coincidence. It's an answer to 2 years of prayers." Sophia, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Are you the nice man Papa used to talk about, the one with the big ranch and the horses who sang on the radio?" George couldn't hold back his tears any longer. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I am." The crowd was now completely silent. Many people wiping away their own tears as they witnessed this extraordinary reunion. Phones continued recording, but the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to reverence. This was no longer just a story about a celebrity helping hungry children. This was about destiny, about redemption, about the mysterious ways that life brings people together when they need each other most. Sergeant Martinez cleared his throat, gently. "Mr. Strait, if I may ask, what exactly happened to their father?" George stood slowly, his hand resting protectively on Miguel's shoulder. "Carlos was part of a construction crew renovating my stables. A severe thunderstorm came up suddenly, and a scaffold collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital, but—" George paused, the memory still painful. "He didn't make it. I was on tour at the time, but I came back immediately. I attended his funeral, but the family was so overwhelmed with grief, and I didn't want to intrude." Miguel looked up at George with a mixture of awe and confusion. "You came to Papa's funeral?" "I did, son. I sat in the back and I watched your mother cry, and I watched you try to be strong for your little sister. I wanted to help then, but I didn't know how. I was afraid that my presence would only make things worse." "The insurance money," Miguel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Mama said we got money because Papa died at work. That was from you?" "The company's insurance covered it, but I made sure your family received additional compensation. I wanted to do more, but your mother moved soon after, and my lawyers lost contact with you." Officer Johnson, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. "This is incredible. You've been looking for these children for 2 years." "Every day," George admitted. "I've had private investigators trying to track down the family. I set aside money for the children's education, for anything they might need, but they seemed to have disappeared." Miguel's voice was small when he spoke. "We moved to a cheaper apartment after Papa died. Then Mama had to get more jobs, and we moved again and again." The boys' understanding of their situation was heartbreaking in its simplicity. George felt a surge of protective anger. These children had been struggling while he had millions of dollars and no way to find them. Carlos Martinez had died on his property, and his children had been going hungry while George lived in comfort. The injustice of it made him want to scream. "Miguel, Sophia," George said, his voice firm with determination, "I want you to know that your father was a good man, the best kind of man, and I promise you, on his memory, that you will never be hungry again. You will never be alone again. Your father saved my horses from that storm before the scaffold fell. He was a hero." Sophia tugged on George's shirt. "Did Papa really save horses?" "He did, sweetheart. The storm spooked them, and they were in danger. Your Papa got them to safety before he got hurt." George's voice caught as he remembered the details his ranch manager had told him. Carlos had put the animals' safety before his own, even as the weather deteriorated. The store manager, Mr. Chen, had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. "Mr. Strait, this is the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed. These children, they found you." "Or I found them," George replied, though he knew the truth was more complex than that. Some force greater than chance had brought them together in this parking lot, at this moment, when they all needed each other most. Richard, who had been standing silently since his suspension, suddenly spoke up. I had no idea. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His voice was barely a whisper, the full weight of his actions now apparent. He had not just mistreated hungry children, he had mistreated the children of a man who had died a hero. George looked at Richard with a mixture of anger and pity. Sorry doesn't feed hungry children. Sorry doesn't make up for the fear you put in their eyes, but maybe sorry is a start. Sergeant Martinez was shaking his head in wonder. "In 20 years of police work, I've never seen anything like this. The odds of this happening." "There are no odds when it comes to fate," said the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier. "This was meant to be." George pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Tom, it's George. Cancel everything for today. Cancel the sound check, move the meet and greet, do whatever you have to do." "No, I'm not sick. I'm exactly where I need to be." He paused, looking down at Miguel and Sophia. "And Tom, remember that family I've been looking for? I found them." Gee! As George ended the call, he realized that finding Carlos's children was only the beginning. Now he had to figure out how to make up for 2 years of their struggle, how to honor the memory of their father, and how to ensure that these precious children never experienced want or fear again. But first, they needed food, and they needed their mother. And George Strait, the king of country music, was going to make sure that happened, no matter what it took. "Kids," George said, his voice now strong and certain, "are you ready to go shopping? And then, are you ready to see your mama?" Miguel's eyes shone with hope for the first time in days. "Really? We can see mama?" "We're going to do more than that," George promised. "We're going to bring her home." As they prepared to enter the store, none of them could have imagined that this was just the beginning of a transformation that would not only change their lives forever, but would also inspire millions of people around the world who would soon learn about the incredible power of compassion, destiny, and second chances. The parking lot slowly began to empty as people dispersed, but the videos they had recorded were already being uploaded to social media platforms, shared and reshared at lightning speed. By the time George, Miguel, and Sophia walked into that store, their story was already beginning to touch hearts across the globe. But the most incredible part of their journey was still ahead, waiting to unfold in ways that none of them could possibly imagine. George had found the children he had been searching for, but discovering them was only the first step in a story that would prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. As they walked toward the store's entrance, Miguel slipped his small hand into George's larger one, and Sophia took George's other hand. For the first time since their father's death, the children felt safe, protected, and loved. And George felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. The peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. The automatic doors slid open before them, and they stepped inside together, ready to begin the next chapter of their remarkable story. Behind them, the crowd remained in stunned silence, many people openly weeping at what they had just witnessed. The videos being shared online were already accumulating millions of views, with comments pouring in from around the world. Hashtags like Maria's George Strait Hero and Destiny in Texas were trending, but none of the social media attention mattered compared to the miracle that had just unfolded. Sergeant Martinez turned to his partner with tears in his eyes. "In all my years on the force, I never believed in destiny, but after today—" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Officer Johnson nodded, equally moved. Those children just found their guardian angel, and Mr. Strait found his redemption. As the 3 figures disappeared into the store, the Texas sun seemed to shine a little brighter, as if nature herself was celebrating this extraordinary reunion that proved sometimes the most impossible dreams really do come true. 2 hours later, George's SUV pulled into County General Hospital's parking lot, followed by a police escort. Word of the extraordinary story had spread like wildfire, and news crews were already setting up outside, hoping to capture the reunion the entire world was now following. Miguel and Sophia sat in the back seat, their stomachs finally full after the most extraordinary shopping trip of their lives. George had filled 3 shopping carts with enough food to last months, along with new clothes, toys, and everything else the children needed. But more than material gifts, he had given them hope. "Are you nervous about seeing Mama?" Sophia asked Miguel as they approached the hospital entrance. "A little," Miguel admitted, clutching the small teddy bear George had bought for him to give to their grandmother. "But I'm more excited. Wait until Mama sees that we found the man Papa used to tell us about." George felt his heart tighten at the boy's words. Carlos had apparently talked about him to his children, probably sharing stories about the famous country singer whose ranch he was working on. The thought that Carlos had died while trying to provide for these beautiful children made George more determined than ever to honor his memory. Inside the hospital, they made their way to the cardiac care unit where Carlos's mother lay recovering. The hallways seemed endless as they walked, Miguel holding George's hand on one side and Sophia on the other. Nurses recognized George immediately, but something about the moment's solemnity kept them from approaching. As they rounded the corner to room 314, George saw a woman sitting in the hallway, her head in her hands. She was small and delicate, with dark hair pulled back in a tired ponytail and clothes that spoke of someone living at the hospital for days. When she looked up, George saw Miguel's eyes in her face, and he knew immediately this was Carla Martinez. "Mama!" Both children cried simultaneously, breaking free from George's hands and running down the hallway to their mother. Carla's face transformed from exhaustion to pure joy as she caught her children in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she held them tight. "Miguel, Sophia, how did you get here? I was so worried when I called Mrs. Rodriguez and she said you were gone." George hung back, allowing the family their moment of reunion, but Miguel quickly turned and beckoned him forward. "Mama, this is George, the George Papa used to tell us about, the one with the ranch and the horses." Carla looked up, confusion evident in her eyes as she took in the sight of the famous country singer standing in the hospital hallway. I don't understand. How do you know my children?" George approached slowly, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Martinez, my name is George Strait. Your husband Carlos was working on my ranch when the accident happened. I've been searching for you and your children for 2 years." The color drained from Carla's face as the implications of his words sank in. You're the owner of the ranch where Carlos..." She couldn't finish the sentence, the pain still too raw even after all this time. "Yes, ma'am. And I want you to know that I've carried the guilt of that day with me every moment since it happened. Carlos was a hero, Mrs. Martinez. He saved my horses during the storm before the scaffold collapsed. He put their safety before his own." Carla began to cry again, but these were different tears. Tears of pride mixed with grief. "That sounds like Carlos. He always put others first, even animals. He taught Miguel to be the same way." "Mrs. Martinez," George continued, his voice gentle but firm, "I found your children this morning in a parking lot, hungry and alone, asking strangers for food. They've been taking care of each other while you've been here with your mother." Carla's face crumpled with shame and guilt. "I had no choice. When Mama collapsed, I couldn't leave her, but I couldn't bring the children to the hospital either. Mrs. Rodriguez was supposed to watch them, but she got sick and I didn't know what else to do." "You don't need to explain anything to me," George said softly. "You're a good mother who was faced with an impossible situation. But I'm here now, and I want to help. I want to make sure that you and your children never have to struggle like this again." Miguel stepped forward, his young voice carrying a wisdom that broke everyone's heart. "Mama, Senor George has been looking for us for 2 years. He wanted to help us after Papa died, but we moved too much, and he couldn't find us." Sophia tugged on her mother's sleeve. "And Mama, he bought us so much food and new clothes, and he says we don't have to be hungry anymore." Carla looked at George with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what to say. Your kindness today, finding my children and bringing them safely to me, I can never repay you." Mrs. Martinez, the debt is mine to pay. Your husband died on my property while working to provide for his family. The least I can do is make sure that family is taken care of." George paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have a proposition for you, if you'll hear me out." Before Carla could respond, a doctor approached their group. "Mrs. Martinez, I have good news about your mother. She's awake and asking for you. Her speech is improving, and we're cautiously optimistic about her recovery." The relief on Carla's face was evident as she stood to follow the doctor. "Can my children come in to see her?" "Of course. And sir," the doctor addressed George, "I don't know who you are, but thank you for bringing this family together. Mrs. Martinez has been beside herself with worry about her children." As they entered the hospital room, an elderly woman with silver hair looked up from her bed. Despite her weakness, her face lit up when she saw Miguel and Sofia. "Mis nietos," she whispered, "my grandchildren." Miguel approached carefully. "Abuela, we brought you a present." He handed her the teddy bear George had bought, and her eyes filled with tears. Carla quickly explained in Spanish who George was and how he had found the children. The grandmother's expression changed to awe and gratitude as she reached out toward George. "Gracias," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my grandchildren." George took her hand gently. "Your grandchildren saved me, Senora. They reminded me what's truly important." As the family reunion continued, George stepped outside into the hallway to make a phone call. "Tom? Yes, it's George again. I need you to set up a press conference for before tonight's show." "No, not about me. About a family that's going to change everything for us." When George returned to the room, he found Carla sitting beside her mother's bed, while Miguel and Sofia told their grandmother about their adventure that morning. The scene was so peaceful, so right, that George almost hated to interrupt. "Mrs. Martinez," George said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, and George took a deep breath before continuing. "I meant what I said about wanting to help your family. I've set aside money for your children's education, enough to send them through college if they choose. But more than that, I'd like to offer you a job." Carla looked confused. "A job?" "Mr. Strait, I appreciate everything you've done, but I don't know anything about music or not in the music business," George interrupted gently. "I need someone to manage the day-to-day operations of a charitable foundation I'm starting in your husband's memory. The Carlos Martinez Foundation will help families who find themselves in situations like yours, hard-working people who fall through the cracks when tragedy strikes." Carla's eyes widened in shock. "You want to start a foundation in Carlos's name? He was a good man who died helping others. I can't think of a better way to honor his memory than by helping people the way he would have helped them." George paused. "The job would pay enough that you'd never have to work 3 jobs again. You could spend time with your children, be there for your mother's recovery, and help other families at the same time." Tears streamed down Carla's face as she struggled to find words. "Mr. Strait, this is too much. I don't deserve such kindness. Mrs. Martinez, you deserve this and more. But there's one condition." George's expression grew serious. "Tonight I have a concert here in the city. It's a benefit show, and I'd like to dedicate it to your family and tell your story. I want people to know about Carlos, about his children, about the kind of hero he was. Would you be comfortable with that?" Carla wiped her tears and looked back toward the room where her children were still talking animatedly with their grandmother. "If telling our story can help other families like you helped us today, then yes, Carlos would want that." That evening, 15,000 people packed the arena for George Strait's benefit concert. But this night would be different from any show he had ever performed. As he took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause, but George raised his hand for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin tonight, I want to tell you about a man named Carlos Martinez and how his children changed my life today. And for the next 20 minutes, George told the entire story, from Carlos's heroic death 2 years ago to finding Miguel and Sofia hungry in a parking lot that morning. The arena was completely silent, except for the sound of thousands of people crying. When George introduced the Martinez family, who were sitting in the front row, the crowd gave them a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes. Miguel and Sofia waved shyly, while Carla wept openly, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from complete strangers. Tonight's concert proceeds will go to establishing the Carlos Martinez Foundation, George announced. But more than that, I want everyone here to remember that heroes walk among us every day. They're the construction workers who put others' safety before their own. They're the single mothers working 3 jobs to provide for their children. They're the 8-year-old boys who protect their little sisters when the world seems dark and scary. As George launched into his first song, the arena erupted once again. But the most beautiful sight wasn't the famous singer on stage. It was Miguel and Sofia, finally able to be children again, clapping and singing along with 15,000 new friends who had just learned the power of compassion. 6 months later, the Carlos Martinez Foundation had helped over 200 families facing similar crises. Carla had proven natural at running the organization, bringing the same fierce protectiveness she had shown her children. Miguel and Sofia were thriving in their new school, where Miguel had started a program teaching other children about kindness. Their grandmother had made a full recovery and now lived with the family in a beautiful home. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest miracles. As George often said in interviews, I thought I was helping 2 hungry children, but they saved me. They reminded me that fame and fortune mean nothing if you're not using them to lift others up. Carlos Martinez raised 2 heroes, and through them, he's still changing the world. The story became a symbol of hope worldwide, proving that sometimes angels come disguised as hungry children in parking lots, and that the greatest songs aren't always sung on stage. Sometimes they're lived out in acts of love, compassion, and courage. And in a small framed photo on George's dressing room wall, Carlos Martinez smiles down from heaven, knowing that his children found not just food that day, but a family that would love and protect them forever. The circle of love that began with a hero's sacrifice had grown to encompass thousands of lives, proving that one man's legacy can indeed change the world, one family at a time.